So my title is inspired by a saying that was told to me by a trader from Fujian who I met while I was doing research in Luanda in 2012. It's kind of long, sorry. One day when I was eating lunch with this man and his wife, I spontaneously offered to teach them English. And to this he responded, "This is why we like to make friends. We have this saying, 多一个朋友多一条路. When you make a new friend, you build a new road." Oh. So I don't have time today to go into an in-depth analysis of this phrase, but it clearly points to an interesting convergence of instrumentality and affect in friendship relations. For this man and for many other people, both Chinese and Angolan, who I met in the field, friendship was a way of describing relationships that could be useful or mutually beneficial. Business partners were regularly referred to as friends, and it was almost unimaginable to think of a friendship that did not involve some kind of utilitarian assistance. At the same time, the people that Chinese and Angolan collaborators called their friends were also potential enemies in the sense that they could possibly take advantage, exploit, or harm one another. So even as Chinese and Angolan business partners attempted to collaborate with one another, they were also wary. This saying, "make a new friend, build a new road," prompted me to think more carefully about the three concepts I've highlighted in my subtitle: opportunity, mistrust, and reliability. I became interested in two related questions. One, what are some of the necessary conditions for collaboration between Chinese and Angolan partners? And two, how do Angolan and Chinese business partners initiate and maintain collaborations in a context of widespread mistrust? What I will suggest is that part of what Chinese and Angolan business partners shared was an idea of Angola as a site of immense extractive opportunity, but these opportunities were concealed or blocked. They could only be accessed through strategic personal relationships, the roads mentioned in the title. This imaginary of Angola could become a basis for collaboration at the same time that it perpetuated a shared attitude of mistrust. Attempting to navigate this opaque and mistrustful context, Chinese entrepreneurs, the group that I worked most closely with during my fieldwork, emphasized reliability as an essential characteristic of potential collaborators. I'll elaborate more on the specificity of this concept in a moment. What I'm presenting today is part of an article forthcoming in American Anthropologists, and I'll be happy to go further into any aspect of the conceptual framing during our Q&A. I'd like to use my time here, however, to tell a few stories that I think will illustrate well my main concerns. But first, I'll give you a brief overview of my field site and the ethnographic research on which this talk is based. In the broader context of China's recent political economic engagement with Africa, Angola is often cited as an extreme or exemplary case. After gaining independence from Portugal in 1975, the country was embroiled in a violent civil war that lasted 27 years. When peace was finally declared in 2002, the ruling MPLA party was in desperate need of financing for post-war reconstruction. It first approached Western donors like the IMF and the United States, but it was unwilling or unable to fulfill their conditionalities. So when the Chinese government offered to finance the MPLA's national reconstruction program with loans from China Exim Bank, the Angolan government accepted. Credit lines totaling $4.5 billion would be dispersed for public infrastructure construction. And under the terms of the loan agreement, 70% of the contracts would be given to Chinese state-owned enterprises, and the loans would be repaid with regular shipments of Angolan oil. Over the next few years, Angola became China's #1 source of petroleum imports, and because of this, China's top trading partner in Africa. The Angolan president identified China as a strategic partner, and with the help of credit from Exim Bank as well as other Chinese lenders, declared the entire country a massive construction site. And you'll see a lot of cranes in my slides. By 2010, the Chinese embassy estimated that there were over 450 Chinese companies and nearly 250,000 Chinese citizens working in Angola. So if we accept Howard French's statistic of 1 million migrants, this would be a quarter of the Chinese population of the entire continent. I began conducting fieldwork in Angola in June of 2012 when I took a preliminary 2-month research trip I then returned to Luanda for a longer period in October 2013, at which point I actively sought out an internship with a Chinese organization and ended up with a company that I call Northwest Construction. This was a provincial level SOE that had first come to Angola in 2005 to work as a subcontractor on Exim Bank funded projects. By the time I got to know the company, it was beginning to seek opportunities beyond government contracts, and members of the Trade Department, where I volunteered as a translator for nearly a year, were especially interested in finding local Angolan partners to help them expand their business. Director Deng, party secretary of Northwest Construction and head of its trade department, had been in Angola for nearly 10 years when I met him. I had been told that the Angola subsidiary of his company, Northwest Construction, was considered to be the most promising in the company's entire global network. One night over tea at the compound dormitory, Director Deng explained to me why. There are two main reasons why Angola is rich today, he said. First, because it has oil, and second, because of the way land was distributed after the war. Anyone who got land could use it to make money, so people started to get rich. Now, the money coming from China has given people another opportunity. People will come to you with a project, and when you give them a quote of, say, 1 million, they'll tell you, just add 500,000, or why not make it 2 million? In this way, they can make money without having to do anything as long as they have some connection to the government. I asked whether practices like this, considered corrupt in much of the world, wouldn't be obstacles to business development, but Deng assured me, Angola is a good place to do business because there are so many openings to exploit. In contrast to the ideal of transparency and regulation promoted by measures such as the World Bank's Doing Business rankings, Director Deng saw Angola's malleable regulatory system as a site of opportunity, and so did his potential partners. Researchers of Angola, like the political anthropologist Jan Schubert, have long documented the significance of mobilizing personal connections to get things done in contemporary Angola, especially when navigating bureaucratic procedures. Without these connections, foreigners like the Chinese managers at Northwest Construction would have to find Angolan partners willing to help. Sometimes these helpers appeared on their own. One day, when I was working at the Trade Department offices, an Angolan man walked in and introduced himself as an associate of the National Roads Institute. They had a large project, he said, to build 180 local government offices, 10 in each province. The man explained that if Northwest Construction wanted to be part of the project, he'd need some official documents from us. A letter of introduction, for example, would have to be addressed to the relevant government ministry. My uncle is the minister, he said. I told him I'd have to ask the company's managers whether they were interested. I worked with many Chinese companies, he tried to reassure me, and that's how I go about earning my 10%. And you'll earn something too, at least some 2 or 3%. Whoever hangs out with me makes money, he laughed. Later, you'll go back to the United States a rich woman to show your family all the money you made in Africa. Potential collaborators like this visitor attempted to seduce with images of Angola or Africa as a realm of vast opportunities for profit. At the same time that Angola appeared as a place for money to be made, however, it was also understood to be governed by opaque and highly personalized structures of power. Access to these structures would determine whether a business could thrive or flounder. But how could one know whether a potential partner would really follow through on his promises? The imaginary of Angola as a money-making paradise, accessible only through crucial connections to forbidding structures of power, lent itself just as easily to fantasies of enrichment as it did to fears of deception. The Chinese business people I worked with felt vulnerable to extortion by Angolan regulatory authorities. Moreover, they may have had even more reason to doubt since they were themselves engaged in various forms of brokerage or deception. In his ethnography of mistrust, Matthew Carey defines mistrust as a general sense of the unreliability of a person or thing. He presents the intriguing idea that people might mistrust one another because they do not assume to know who others really are. Mistrust is therefore an attitude that presumes the radical autonomy and unknowability of others. It, quote, assumes other people to be both free and fundamentally uncontrollable. Other anthropologists of mistrust have argued that attitudes of mistrust do not preclude relationship building. In fact, mistrust might be conceived as a form of engagement characterized by the paradox of withholding while participating. The tentative cultivation of mistrustful collaboration was illustrated well in a discussion I observed about a road construction contract. Director Deng asked me to call a man named Malachias and tell him to come to the Trade Department offices, quote, to understand the situation of the road building project he's introducing to us. To my knowledge, Deng's company had no experience with road construction. However, a friend of Deng's, a Chinese entrepreneur whose company did have the capacity and experience to build roads, would also send representatives to the meeting. Deng was effectively serving as a broker. By using the pronoun we, he discursively merged the two companies into one unit. Malachias, an elderly Angolan man dressed in a suit, arrived later that afternoon. He'd worked with Northwest Construction on a large project in the past, and Deng had later invited him on an all expenses paid trip to China, ostensibly for work purposes. They considered each other to be friends. Two Chinese employees of the road building company joined the meeting, a female translator and a male engineer, both in their 20s. Malachias explained to them that officially they'd have to provide copies of all their licenses, a formal proposal, and a bank guarantee in order to bid for the project. But the governor of Uige, where the project would be located, was a friend of his. Therefore, he was certain that we would get the contract. The road building company employees presented Malachias with a portfolio of their previous work and a file of their company's documents. Malachias flipped through them, nodding his head. He seemed satisfied, maybe even impressed. But then he asked a doubtful question. But are these roads you've built good? I don't want those disposable roads. We need quality. Because you know, there are some Chinese companies here that build roads and 2 years later they fall apart. He then turned to me, letting me know that he was aware of Deng's position as broker of the deal. I want to give this project to Deng because I know his company is good, but I don't know this company at all. The translator began to murmur that her company did high quality work, but Malachias interrupted her. Although she could understand, he said to me in Portuguese, tell them I have projects in Malange, in Luanda Norte, and Luanda Sul, he said, naming various Angolan provinces. I can get the projects for them, but they'll have to give me something as well. He then turned directly to the translator. Do you understand? She nodded and said without smiling, yes, comissão, commission. This concept was apparently familiar to her. But before agreeing to compensate Malachias for his services, she turned quickly to her colleague and whispered in Chinese, do you think this guy's reliable? The conversation continued for a while and was concluded without a final decision as to how Malachias would be paid. As the translator and her colleague walked out, Malachias turned to me and said, this is the problem with Chinese people. They distrust. I don't have a bad heart. Interestingly, both Angolan and Chinese partners in this negotiation displayed mistrustful attitudes. Moreover, neither party hid their distrust of the other, and yet they continued to work together. Malachias questioned the quality of the company's roads, while the translator questioned his reliability. Still, neither the translator nor Malachias walked away from the collaboration. They eventually traveled to Uige together and ultimately won the construction bid. So in such an environment of mutual distrust, how could Chinese entrepreneurs know who to rely on? During my fieldwork, I heard Chinese business people make constant reference to the reliability or unreliability of potential collaborators. If mistrust is a way of relating to that which is unknown and unpredictable, Chinese entrepreneurs' search for reliability was a similar kind of engagement with unknowability or opacity, the opacity of their partners' backgrounds and motivations, and the opacity of Angola itself. I learned over time, however, that reliability for them meant something very specific. Since transparency and honesty were usually not expected, another aspect of reliability may have been considered more important: efficacy or deliverability. I'll give a final example to illustrate. Director Deng occasionally met with a man named Silvio to discuss potential business collaborations. These could be anything from building a bottled water plant to mining for diamonds. One afternoon, after an outing with Silvio, I asked Deng if he thought the man was reliable. "I think he's very reliable," said Deng without a hint of doubt in his voice. He then explained why. "Silvio knows all kinds of people. Once he came to my office with a friend of his who he said needed help importing chemicals from China. I couldn't understand what the chemicals were, so I asked him, 'What exactly are you trying to do with these?' He pulled out a piece of paper. It looked just like a US bill, although there was something not quite right about it. He said, 'If we get these chemicals and wash this paper in them, it will turn into a US dollar.' I said, 'No, no, that's illegal. I can't be involved in something like that.' But that just shows the level of people he's connected to." For many people, counterfeiting currency would be the ultimate sign of deceptiveness. But for Deng, Silvio's involvement in a highly dishonest and illegal activity was actually evidence of his reliability. Even though he refused to join this particular business venture, Deng learned from Silvio's proposal that he possessed strategic connections that could prove effective in future collaborations. Calling Silvio reliable was a way for Deng to evaluate not his honesty or the truthfulness of his claims, but rather his effectiveness as a partner and the deliverability of his promises. To be reliable was not a judgment of one's character in general, but one's ability to fulfill the terms of the business partnership. This was what would be necessary to turn social connections into viable roads. I'll end by briefly sharing one implication of all of this that I'm interested in exploring more. Although my analysis privileges the reflections of Chinese managers, in part because of the way I was situated in the field, I believe my ethnographic material points to the existence of certain shared imaginaries and practices between Angolan and Chinese actors. In the examples I've provided, we see a variety of actors pursuing mutually beneficial and mutually exploitative collaborations alongside reciprocal doubts. The work of brokerage and facilitation through which 10% are accumulated becomes a mode of livelihood for a wide range of Chinese and Angolan individuals and not just political elites. Therefore, rather than beginning from an assumption that there is necessarily an opposition between Angolan or African perspectives, people, or political positions on the one hand, and on the other Chinese ones, I think it would be worth exploring further what perspectives or practices are shared or perhaps become shared in these zones of Chinese-African interaction. But I think I'm close to being out of time, so I'll look forward to hearing your thoughts during the Q&A. Thank you very much.